Well, we're glad you're here, and we are in Walking with Jesus, Volume 2, Lesson 37. And we're going to be going through the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to be going through this actually for, I think about 6 weeks. It takes to get through all the stuff that Jesus taught there. And of course, there are those who could spend their months, maybe even a year, just digesting just the Sermon on the Mount. There is a lot of material in there that we can take, but for our purposes, we're going to cover it in about 6 weeks. So we're going to talk today about how to relate to the world. Here is our little timeline, and we're coming right down into the second year of Jesus' ministry. So he's been preaching for a year. He just ordained the 12 apostles, and we're getting ready now for them to, this is kind of their ordination sermon, so to speak. Now, I don't believe that anyone really wants to be bad. Almost everyone believes that what they did or are doing is good, or at least if it's not good, it's justified to their interpretation of the circumstances. Maybe some people do some bad things, but it's because they think somebody else did something bad and they got to do something bad to them to stop them from doing something bad to them. War would almost be an example of that. To a certain degree, we want to defend ourselves, but sometimes we have to kill other people to stop them from killing us in order to defend ourselves. So what's good in that? Now, some people may see themselves as so bad or evil that they actually think their evil is really justifiable or good. John Dillinger, a famous, infamous criminal from many years past, still thought what he was doing was okay. He justified it. More recent examples, O.J. Simpson, and didn't think what he was doing was bad, or he thought it was justified. And we could name myriads of others, maybe even including ourselves in some circumstances. So how do you and I as Christians relate to the world? How do we demonstrate God's good versus the world's interpretation of what is good? All this stuff that you're hearing happening, the recent terrorist attacks all over the world, they think that what they're doing is justified. We call it bad and evil. How do we determine what is right, and how do we show that God's good is far superior to what they think they are doing is good? And we've got the liberal media. We'll pick on them a little bit. They think that their way of doing things is good. How do we help them see that God sets the moral absolutes and we don't? So, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 32, Jesus continues his ordination sermon just after having selected 12 men to become apostles. And we'll look at some more on the Sermon on the Mount to see how we can live a life that is pleasing to God. And we're going to find at least 5 guidelines just in this section today. So, here is a map of, this is the Sea of Galilee. Here is Capernaum. And over here is, right here is where Jesus allegedly said, "Upon this rock I will build my church," referring to the apostles. Here is a hill about a mile away, and this is the location of the Sermon on the Mount, at least where we believe it is. Beautiful view from this hill, all over. You can see the entire Sea of Galilee from that location. Well, our responsibility to God and man, Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. Jesus says, "Do you think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets? I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." So how can we claim to be... Look, did I finish? No, I didn't. Anyone who breaks one of these least commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's a challenge for us. I can't be good enough to be good enough, to get in on my goodness. How can we claim to be Christian when we live like non-Christians? If we love God, we are grateful for our salvation. We're going to want to live a life that reflects the character, influence, and indwelling presence of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're going to want to be different than those who sin like the devil. To repent means to change the mind. If you love Jesus, you will not want to do those things which hurt him. You will change your mind and your bad behavior to good behavior. And one of the problems that we've noticed in our world today is we have a lot of Christians that are acting like the world. They're not acting like Jesus has changed their lives. They've forgotten their first love. So our challenge, part of our goal here, is to get back to studying Jesus, to get our focus back on our first love, so that we will change our hearts and make sure that we're not getting back and falling back into those old habits. Oh, do we have some old habits? You have old habits, you have old habits. The rest of us have old habits that we don't want to fall back into. And too many Christians have forgotten what Jesus taught and did. They've lost their first love, and they've fallen back into that habit. And so we need to be challenging each other. First, I begin by examining myself. Am I falling back into any old habits? But then I look at those around me, and do I need to encourage them and remind them of what Jesus taught after having first looked at myself? Let's see how we can be different than the world and how we will reflect that God's way is better. That's what we're trying to do as Christians. Let us show the world that Jesus has made a positive difference in our lives and that they should desire to become more like him. Jesus goes on to clarify how we can do that. I want to take just a comment. I got an email today about a minister in Pakistan who is having a very successful ministry, and Christians are being baptized into Christ, being won to Christ all over. Pakistanians are being won to Christ all over Pakistan. His ministry seems to be very successful and having quite an impact in a country where Christians are being constantly killed because they don't follow Allah. So quite an influence on the people and the culture there. And more they kill the Christians, the more Christians seem to thrive because they realize that Jesus is worth dying for. And Jesus offers us something that no other religion can offer. A little sidebar to that. You notice Christians don't go around killing non-Christians? At least not because they're not Christians. We might do it in self-defense if we're being attacked, but we just don't go around looking for other people to kill that don't believe the way we do. Thank goodness that's not what God teaches. So look at this. He says, don't commit murder, Matthew 5:21 and 22. You've heard it said long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. And again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of fire of hell. So if I love my brother, I'm not going to want to be malicious. I'm not going to want to strap a bomb to myself and go blow me up and him up and a few others up with that. I'm not going to want to go committing murder. Now this, just a little sidebar, I'll get there that in just a minute. One of the greater sins of mankind, if actually there is any degree of sin that is greater than another, is the willful taking of another person's life. God is communicating to us the sanctity of life. Whether it's in the womb or getting close to the tomb, doesn't matter. Life has value. And even that person on their deathbed, I don't think we have the right to say, oh, well, let's just shut them off. They might have a right to a certain degree, but that's something that they have to work out between them and God. But we need to not be engaged in willfully taking another person's life. It's simply wrong to another person unless it is in self-defense, or to kill another person unless it is in self-defense or in an act of war. So God doesn't expect us to let others kill us without defending ourselves. Just some Old Testament references, Exodus 22 verses 2 and 3, Proverbs 25 verse 26, you can look those up later. And Luke chapter 22 verse 36, we'll get to that later on in the Welcome with Jesus Bible study. And even in 1 Timothy 5:8 can be applied to self-defense and defense of family as much as to financial provision. Luke, or the reference in Timothy says if a man will not provide for his own household, well, in my opinion, and I'll state it as simply as that, if a man will not protect his own household, he's also worse than an infidel. So protecting yourself, protecting your family is, I think, an important obligation also. It would be wrong for a Christian to let another attacker come into his home and violate his wife or children or take their lives without trying to do something that he can do to defend them, even to the point of killing the attacker. So there are times when self-defense is different than just, I'm angry at you, I'm going to kill you because I'm angry at you. But we've got a lot of that going on in the world today too. Well, settle quarrels. Therefore, Jesus says, if you are offering your gift on the altar and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar and first go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. It is not good for a good Christian witness to say nothing and do things that deliberately, let me rephrase that. It is not a good Christian witness to say and do things that deliberately hurt someone else. And sometimes we do get caught up in malicious talk about people that we don't like or people whose viewpoints we disagree with. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good. Maybe a lot of times it's the latter. Sometimes we say unkind things because of selfish motives, fatigue, and letting that fuel our negative emotions or misunderstanding. How many times have we found out that what I said was not kind? And I've had to think through sometimes comments I've made and had to rephrase or even retract or state them in a way that was a lot more tactful. Our nature is to just blurt out without qualifying what we're saying. And it takes time to qualify what you say. It takes time to put the disclaimer into the message so that people will not misinterpret what you're saying. But that's something that we need to do in order to not get into quarrels that we don't need to get into. We really don't want to offend someone, but if we do, it's good to recognize your error and seek to make amends. Now, notice that Jesus doesn't talk about the one who was offended. He talks about the offender. Yeah, if I've said something that hurt you many years ago, I forget the comment that I made, but it hurt one of the members of our congregation. Now, I did not know about it at the time. It was several days later when someone else told me that when you said this hurt so-and-so. And so I took that opportunity and I actually addressed it in a newsletter that I was sending out to everybody in the church. And I addressed it. If I've said something that hurt you, that was not my intention, and I apologize and ask your forgiveness. And I had to kind of explain where I was coming from and what I meant in a way that was a little more understandable than what I had initially said. And so I know about settling quarrels, diplomacy and tact. You may have to be tough sometimes, but you can even be tough with diplomacy and with a little tactfulness and get your message across. Jesus doesn't talk about the one who was offended. He tells the offender to make the amends. The issue is to seek and at peace and live in harmony with one another regardless of who is at fault. It doesn't matter who the blame is. What matters is learning to get along with each other. Now, I saw another little video clip on the internet this morning. A man who had a racial prejudice over, and this is actually in Australia, attacked some Jewish people verbally. He's right in this guy's face, threatening him, telling him to go back to Israel and to not do this and stop doing that. And finally he grabs hold of the guy, and the Jewish guy grabs hold of him and puts him down on the ground. And several others hold him until the police get there to take him away. So he wasn't trying to get along with people. He was being very offensive. And so the other guy had to put a stop to it. Sometimes we have to defend ourselves. Hopefully we can do it with words, and that will settle most situations. Occasionally we need help. We do not have to be offended by another person unless you wanted to. I went through a crisis in my life about 25 years ago, and in the process of getting some counseling to deal with that, the counselor gave me what I call rules number one. He called them rules number one. There's about 7 or 8 of them. They're all called rules number one because no one is any more important than the others. But those rules helped me to see some things about myself and get a hold of my life and make some adjustments that I needed to make in order to make my life better. One of those rules is nothing from my past can hurt me unless I want it to. And so you can say what you want about me. Another rule was I am not responsible for the other person's thinking. And you can say what you want. I'm the one that decides whether I'm going to be offended by it or not be offended by it. If you meant to offend me and I'm not offended by it, you lose. If you didn't mean to offend me and I take offense at it, then we both lose. So if I choose not to be offended by what other people say or do, then maybe I can grow from it, maybe they can grow from it, and we can build relationships and bridges instead of walls. Well, let's go on a little further. Here is a picture. This is from the Church of the Sermon on the Mount. Capernaum is just off to the left here a little more. Right down there, I believe that is do you see that? No, that would be Capernaum right there, I believe. And the church where Jesus said, upon this rock I'll build my church is over here to the right. That's looking across the Sea of Galilee into, that would be the Decapolis there region. You've heard about that. There's that Ron guy. You're so welcome to join us. So there is your view, and you can see how well you can see all of this is about 15 miles across over this side of the Sea of Galilee. Looking across that. Well, Jesus says, don't commit adultery. Matthew chapter 7, verses 27 to 30. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, those people that want to deny hell, I think they need to consider what Jesus says about that subject, huh? Well, from the very beginning of creation, sex has always been for marriage of one husband and one woman for life. One man and one woman for life. Anything else is outside of God's design. And we could talk about and get on a big long discussion about how our world is in so much trouble because we have gotten outside, we, generally speaking, the public, have gotten outside of God's design for sex, love, and marriage. When we follow God's standards, it is the most intimate way that a man and a wife can express their love and commitment to each other. It's called going all the way because you can't go any further in terms of intimacy and sharing with each other than through the sexual relationship. When we follow God's standard, any kind of sex outside of marriage of one man and one woman for life is sin. Any kind of sex outside of marriage is full of negative consequences. You've got the fear of discovering. You've got the fear of being found out. You've got the fear of pregnancy. You've got the fear of sexually transmitted diseases. You've got the fear of rejection. When that person finally decides, oh, this is a one-night stand, or I'm tired of you, and we have no marriage, we have no commitment, I'm going to go find somebody else, and then you go through the rejection. Divorce does the same thing. You go through the rejection, and you've lost that person to whom you have given yourself in the most intimate way that you can give yourself, and now, after a short time or a long time or however much time, for whatever reasons, right, wrong, or otherwise, they've rejected you and they've gone after someone else. That is very, very painful experience to go through for those who have gone through it. Life expectancy is lower. Promiscuity destroys that potential intimacy. So looking at pornography on the internet where it's so convenient, you think nobody knows. Well, I tell you what, I can tell by the things that I go shopping for when I'm looking for things to buy on Amazon. Next thing you know, I've got ads popping up in Facebook saying, hey, you want to buy this, you want to buy this, you want to buy this. You think that there's any page that I click on my computer that somebody doesn't know that I've clicked on that page? I'm looking for images to put in some of the PowerPoints that I put together for sermons that I preach and so forth. And I got to be careful where I go because somebody knows what page I've clicked on. And some server, now maybe somebody's not watching it themselves, but if there ever came up a situation where I was on trial for something for being a Christian, they'll, well, didn't you on this certain day click on this website and look at this and this? And I've got, I don't want to have to go through that kind of explanation. I don't want to be one of those persons that when I die, somebody goes onto my computer and finds, oh, Glenn was into this and doing this and looking at that and so forth. So you just don't go there in the first place. You don't have to worry about that. But it's a challenge. As guys, they're more visual than the girls are, so maybe the girls aren't as tempted as guys are, but it's still a challenge. And even in culture, in society, you see somebody that attracts your attention. Are you thinking godly thoughts, or are you getting caught up in worldly thoughts? We don't want to commit adultery with our mind because every sin begins with the mind and then is carried out with the body. Now, if you say, oh, wait a minute, I'm being tempted to look at something or think something I shouldn't be thinking, you say, whoop, I'm not going to go there, then that's just a temptation. But if you think, yeah, this might be interesting, or I wonder, I wish, or then it starts to become something, a temptation. That's what we want to avoid. We want to recognize the temptation and stop the temptation before it becomes a sin in our lives, because sin only seeks to destroy. And promiscuity destroys the intimacy of the marriage relationship. Jesus stresses that we must exercise self-control to not violate God's standards or another person. And we've got one more area we're going to look at today, and he says, don't get a divorce. Notice he says that right after he says, don't commit adultery. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife, Matthew 5:31 and 32, must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So for those of you that are divorced and remarried, take it on the chin. With God's love, you sinned. Fortunately, adultery is not the unforgivable sin. Divorce and remarriage is not the unforgivable sin, but it is still sin. And if you've been there, we've been there, it's not the end of your life. God can change people's lives. We've heard of story after story where alcoholics or drug addicts have gotten rid of their own behavior and God has changed their lives. We've heard stories of people that were caught up in pornography or prostitution or other sorts of crimes, and they got a hold of Jesus and Jesus changed their lives. And so no matter what your past has been, your future does not have to be. If you've been guilty of any of these sins that we've talked about today, recognize that your walk with Jesus has changed your life and you do not have to be caught up in that anymore. Don't get a divorce. Marriage is for life, and anything else dishonors God. Now, divorce means that you don't know how to love. Divorce means that you don't keep your word. Divorce means that you're selfish. I'm more concerned about having my way than loving my spouse and thinking what is best for her or what is best for our relationship. It's all about me. Divorce means that you did not respect God to keep your marriage together. If we've got God in the middle of our marriage, the temptations to divorce go down tremendously. I would strongly encourage you that if you're not getting with your wife or your husband and praying together for each other, and not for God to change your spouse, but for God to bless your spouse, to fill them with his love and help them as they work through the things that they're working through in their lives. If you will pray with your spouse, your marriage will be 10 times better. That's just my opinion. That's something Sylvia and I started doing when we were dating. Our first date, we closed in prayer. Our second date, we closed in prayer. Last night, before we climbed into bed, we got at the foot of the bed. We got down before our bed, and on my bed, I have a nightlight up there at the top of the bed that has a cross and a Bible in it, stained glass look. And we pray. That is our holy place in our bedroom every night before we go to bed. And I pray for God to bless her. I pray for God to help me be loving towards her and how I interact with her. And I believe that's one of the things that's made our marriage where it is and been very powerful. Divorce hurts children. And you could talk about stories, and it doesn't matter how old the children are. Now, when they're younger, they may take a lot of the blame themselves. But even when they're not younger, they get a little older, a lot of times they're forced to choose between one parent and another. Oh, I want to stay with dad. No, I want to stay with mom. Mom says bad things about dad, or dad says bad things about mom, and the children are caught in the middle. This is my mom, I love her. This is my dad, I love him, but they treat each other this way. That's not loving. And it is very hard on children. Even adult children have a hard time with divorced parents. Keep your marriage together. Make it last a lifetime. Keep the promise you made. And when you said, for better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till God separates us according to his holy ordinance. Divorce sets a bad example to the world. And again, as we started out in this very, how can we be a witness to the world when we're doing the things the world's doing? And one of the tragedies of our current society is that Christians are getting divorced just as much as the world. Now, that doesn't mean that every other Christian couple is getting divorced, fortunately, but the bottom line is that too many Christians, instead of learning to pray together, learning to love each other, remembering their first love for each other, are letting their selfishness and all these other things listed here get in the way, and they think that divorce is an escape. I can tell you from observation and experience that divorce creates more problems than it solves. And so it is not the problem solver that the world sometimes thinks it is. And those who have been divorced will confirm. It did not solve. It may have gotten them away from this situation, but a lot of times they get into another relationship that's very similar to the first one because the problem is not the other person. I have met the enemy. I found out that he is me. I used to try to blame the other guy. When I dealt with myself, then I could change my life and not go down that road anymore. Well, our conclusion is this: God knows the best way for us to live. And we should be challenged to find that way and follow his will for our lives. The most blessed people on earth are those who realize that God's way is the best way. And that's what we're seeking to do. That's what we're seeking to learn. That's how we're seeking to live in our lives, is to follow God's way, because we know that his way is better, whether we sometimes understand that or not. Well, next week, Jesus is going to tell us how we can live better than the world. That's a good thing. right now we're going to stop and have some discussion time and do the discussion questions.